I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse.
Marlon Brando was one of the biggest stars Hollywood ever created. He spent decades bucking the system, trashing the press, insulting politicians, even slamming his own industry. He had so much clout that in 1973, he skipped the Oscars and sent a Native American activist to reject his Best Actor award for The Godfather.
Accepting the award for Marlon Brando and The Godfather, Miss Shasheen Littlefeather.
It was vintage Brando, and he got away with all of it until he said that Jews run Hollywood.
Hollywood is run by Jews. It's owned by Jews. And they should have a greater sensitivity about the issue of people who are suffering.
Days later, Brando issued a written apology through the Simon Wiesenthal Center and then apologized to Jewish leaders in person. I'm Ken LaCorte. Here I look at controversial topics, sometimes radioactive ones like this, but not with hate or finger-pointing. I truly believe these issues and subjects help us understand how our world works, and that's gotta be a good thing. So let's talk about the elephant in the room. Do Jews control the media? It's a tricky topic for a couple reasons, and I think the top one is anti-Semites really love to talk about it. I mean, there's a large group of people out there who blame Jews for anything bad in life. I did a video about illegal immigration in the United States, and a number of comments just said it was all caused by the Jews, which I found odd. There are a lot of memes that you'll see on social media saying Jews run every news outlet imaginable, and they often just make up those facts. Heck, I've been accused here of both working for the Mossad and of being funded by Jewish groups. Again, odd. But on the other side, you have Jewish organizations like the Anti-Defamation League who essentially say this topic here, it's not a theory to examine, but an anti-Semitic question in and of itself. According to the ADL, even suggesting that Jews have disproportionate influence in media is one of the core tropes of anti-Semitism. And when Americans say things like that in polls, it's used as evidence of bigotry. A 2015 poll shows 25% of people worldwide believe Jews have too much control over the media. To the ADL, those numbers are troubling. But to me, they're a starting point for a real conversation. Because reality is somewhere between those two extremes. And in that space is a place for some honest talk. And the antidote to bad opinions, it's not censorship, it's more speech, smarter speech. And look, this is a topic that matters because the media is important. It doesn't just report about things, it shapes our culture. Whether we like it or not, a huge part of how we see the world comes from what we watch, what we read, and what shows up in our feeds. And if one group has an outsized role in deciding that content, then yeah, it's worthy understanding how and why. So I worked at Fox News for a long time. And one time I was out in the field for a big trial, and we had a good number of staffers there. That dinner, I looked around the table and noticed that about a quarter of them were Jewish. Now, it didn't bother me. These were my friends. But knowing that Jews comprise about 2% of the country, it certainly raised my curiosity. 20 years later, I'm trying to answer that question. But how? It's not like you can bring this up in the break room without getting a call from HR. There's no index, there's no scorecard or official media control database. But the question still matters, so let's break it down. Because to properly answer, do Jews control the media, you actually have to define all three parts of that sentence. First, what does it mean to be Jewish? Is it a religion, an ethnicity, a culture? If your mom's Jewish but you're an atheist, what are you? What if you light Hanukkah candles but also eat bacon and don't believe in God? Even Jews argue about this, so the first part of the question is it's more complicated than it sounds. Then there's the word control. And that's the one that freaks out a lot of people. It conjures up images of smoke-filled rooms, puppet strings, and secret meetings. But is that what control means? Or does it mean something softer, like heavy influence, disproportionate ownership, cultural shaping? Control can mean owns the company, or it can mean set the tone, and those are different things. And what's the media? This one's probably the hardest to answer. 50 years ago it was pretty easy because it was a narrow universe. You had 3 broadcast networks, 1 or 2 big newspapers in each city, a handful of national magazines, and a bunch of radio stations. That was it. Today, it's radically different. The traditional players are still there, 5,000 newspapers, over 1,000 TV stations, 15,000 radio stations. But what we've recently seen is an explosion of thousands of new media outlets, big and small, and pundits and influencers. Heck, even me. And the AI boom is going to make that universe even bigger. So let's start with the easiest part of the media to analyze. Do Jews control Hollywood? And the answer to that, it's a pretty solid yes. Although it's a lot more historically true than today because it's dispersing like the rest of the media. And Jews didn't just run Hollywood, they created it. The founders of Paramount, Universal, 20th Century Fox, MGM, Warner Brothers, they weren't Hollywood royalty when they started. They were Jewish immigrants, many of them poor, all of them outsiders. They didn't come from power, but they built it. And by the 20s and 30s, they turned the novelty of silent films into a national obsession. They locked down the whole system. actors, writers, directors, and created an industry where a handful of companies controlled what got made. But it didn't stop with the studios. The whole industry evolved around them. Agencies, managers, publicists, financiers. Success bred infrastructure. People hired their friends, mentored people like themselves, helped the next generation, and over time, that became a pipeline, one that was mostly Jewish. And not because of a master plan, but because that's how networks work. And at the top of every one of the companies I mentioned were Jewish executives. As they grew in influence, they controlled not just movies, but how America saw itself. Interestingly, for the first few decades of that, they rarely made anything overtly Jewish. Hollywood wasn't pushing religion or broadcasting Jewish pride. In fact, the early moguls, they were worried about drawing attention to that. They didn't want to be seen as outsiders or tribal. They wanted to be Americans, to sell the American dream. So for years, they stayed away from Jewish characters, Jewish stories, even Jewish names. It wasn't until the 60s and 70s that films and TV shows began to reflect more of that identity openly. And even then, it came in cautiously and slowly. Fast forward to today, and that legacy is still strong. The major studios, Disney, Paramount, Warner Brothers, Universal, are still disproportionately led by Jewish executives. The upper ranks of Hollywood's creative and business machinery remain filled with Jewish producers, agents, and financiers, but it is in the midst of a change. Because the biggest power centers today are tech companies, Netflix, Amazon, Apple, streaming platforms, not film lots. And while those companies have plenty of Jewish executives too, it's not the same as the old Hollywood machine. So aside from Hollywood, how influential are Jews throughout the rest of the media? Now, that's a harder question to answer than you think, because even for someone like me who spent decades in it, as I explained earlier, the media is massive. There are close to 2 million people working in it just in the United States. And unlike race or gender, there's no official box to check for religion. There's no public list of who's Jewish and who's not, which, for the record, is probably how it should be, because that can get a little creepy. The reality is also, I couldn't find any academic or journalistic study that tried to quantify the percentage of media ownership or leadership by religion or Jewish people. But a look at some of the very largest media companies shows that a lot are run by Jewish people. ABC is owned by Disney, headed by Bob Iger. CBS is part of Paramount Global, controlled by Shari Redstone. NBC and MSNBC are owned by Comcast, which is run by Brian Roberts. CNN is part of Warner Brothers, run by David Zaslav. Facebook and Instagram is led by Mark Zuckerberg. Google was co-founded by Sergey Brin, who's Jewish, though it's now run by Sundar Pichai, who's not. For most of its existence, YouTube was run by Susan Wojcicki. Reddit and a lot of other outlets are controlled by Advanced Publications, run by Donald Newhouse. And finally, there's the New York Times, which is still the flagship of American newspapers. It's run by A.G. Sulzberger and Meredith Kopit Levin. In fact, since Adolph Oakes took over the Times in 1896, it's been run by a Jewish member of his family ever since. So look, that's not a numerical study, but to me, it's clear that there's a representation of Jews at the top of U.S. media that well exceeds their population numbers. So all of this still raises the big question: why? Why are Jews so overrepresented? Not just in media, but in so many other high-achieving professions. Part of it's culture. For generations, Jewish communities emphasized education, literacy, and professional excellence. They account for a massive share of academic awards and top university slots and intellectual awards. They've won 22% of all Nobel Prizes. Heck, I did a whole video on that. They're disproportionately well-educated and disproportionately drawn to white-collar professions. And then there's the thing I described earlier. Networks matter. People help their friends. They mentor people they know. I once worked with a reporter who would regularly bring in a USC journalism grad when a job opened up at our company. Her community was her alma mater, and she wanted to help them out. And there's nothing overtly wrong with that. People help their friends, and when someone gets into a position of power, they often pull up others with them. That's human nature. But over time, it can create bubbles. If the same kind of people keep hiring and promoting the same kind of people, industries start to narrow. I'm not saying it's malicious, but gatekeeping doesn't always need a gate. And over the years, that can shape an industry. So what does all this tell us? It tells us that there's real overrepresentation in top leadership, especially in legacy media, Hollywood, and some major tech platforms. But it doesn't tell us how much that leadership actually changes the content that you and I see. So let's look at that. First, let's ask how much of being the big boss of a news organization, for instance, how does that actually affect its editorial point of view? Because it's not as straightforward as you might think. Let's start with one that is.
False news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets without checking facts first.
Now, that's obviously creepy as hell, and it's clearly an example of someone high up in a corporation dictating editorial to a number of outlets. But generally, real life is a lot messier than that, especially in big media companies. Let me give you an example from Fox News, which is run by Rupert Murdoch. His company didn't run just Fox News. It owned over 200 media entities, newspapers, television stations, book publishers, magazines, movie studios, you name it. Those news outlets were all over the map geographically and often politically. Murdoch owned both the conservative New York Post and the very liberal Village Voice at the same time. And I can tell you firsthand that most of the Fox Entertainment Division guys hated Fox News. And so did a lot of the local Fox television stations around the country. So did Rupert Murdoch control all of it? Absolutely. He could hire and fire anyone he wanted. If he wanted a memo read on air, it'd get read on air, although I really don't recall that ever happening. But practically speaking, no one's sitting at a desk approving every story or every segment. A media company that size makes thousands of editorial decisions every day, and those decisions are made by thousands of individual employees. So here's where it gets interesting, though. Those employees, they're usually trying to be good journalists, but they're also trying to make the boss happy, because that's how you succeed in corporate life. You figure out what your boss's priorities are, even if they're unspoken. And that can absolutely affect the kind of journalism that gets done. Here's an example. In the early 2000s, Murdoch was trying to expand into China. He was traveling there constantly, investing heavily, and it was obvious that if the Chinese government didn't like what you were doing, you weren't doing any business there. Now imagine you're an editor at one of his outlets, and a pitch comes in, a big story about how Chinese are abusing people in their re-education camps. You didn't get a memo telling you to spike it. You've probably never even met the big boss, but you know what's going on, and in the back of your head, you're going to wonder, is this story going to create problems for me? It's not something that happens frequently, but it's real. Could you imagine being a producer at MSNBC who uncovers something really good about the Trump administration? How hard do you think he'd fight for that at the editorial staff meeting? That's how influence works in the real world. Rarely through orders from above, but from signals about who's in charge and what they care about. Which, of course, then leads us to the question, how does Jewish overrepresentation in media affect what we see? Did Brando have a point? Are Hollywood films more positive or at least less negative towards Jewish characters? I mean, I really don't know how to answer that one besides speculation. What I can say, though, from my personal experience watching Hollywood films and movies throughout my entire life, it's pretty clear that devout Christians are fairly often smacked around, portrayed as hypocrites, bigots, or just backwards rubes. It's hard to quantify or even give a fair perspective to how much that is, or really how much it deserves to be. But to me, that seems apparent. And in the news world, how about there? From a wider perspective, American Jews are much more likely than the average American to be liberal and to vote Democratic. In the 2020 election, around 70% of Jewish voters went for Biden. They've been consistently one of the Democratic Party's most loyal voter blocs and contributors. So if you've got an industry with disproportionate Jewish leadership, and that group leans left politically, it's reasonable to assume that it will move the center of gravity. My opinion? I think that's one reason why what we used to call the mainstream media tends to have a liberal tilt. What about the coverage of Israel? This one's trickier. Over the years, the U.S. media outlets have generally been sympathetic to Israel. They portrayed it as a small, Western-style democracy surrounded by hostile authoritarian neighbors. September 11th, well, that hardened that very much. Americans watched Islamic extremists fly planes into buildings, and after that, the idea of Israel being under siege from similar enemies, well, that became a lot easier for everyone to believe. And in fairness, Israelis weren't the ones burning American flags or attacking U.S. soldiers. That kind of thing makes a difference. You want better press in America? Don't blow up our people. That's not all that complicated. So yes, Jewish overrepresentation probably plays a role in how Israel is framed, but it's not the only reason. Geography, politics, history, terrorism, all of that matters. And anyone pretending it's just about who's Jewish in the newsroom, they're not looking at the full picture. But here's where the script flips. Because for all the talk about Jewish influence in the media, something strange has happened in the last few years, especially when it comes to Israel. Some of the outlets with the least Jewish leadership, like Fox News, Talk Radio, the broader conservative media sphere, have been the most pro-Israel. Not cautiously supportive, but full-throated. Flags on screens, IDF interviews, the whole thing. Meanwhile, a lot of the traditional mainstream press, outlets with far more Jewish executives and editors, they've gotten a lot more critical of Israel. The New York Times, MSNBC, CNN. Some of the toughest scrutiny of Israel has come from inside those institutions. In some cases, from Jewish reporters and editors themselves. So what happened? The short version? Politics trumped identity. In today's culture war, your political alignment matters more than your background. The liberal media class, which includes plenty of Jews, is also shaped by progressive ideas about race, colonialism, power structure, and global justice. And those frameworks don't give Israel a pass. In fact, they often put it under a harsher lens. Meanwhile, the populist right, many who don't have any particular connection to Jews, have embraced Israel as a symbol of strength and nationalism and Western values under attack. So whatever influence Jewish identity might have had, in many ways, it's now competing with something stronger, the gravitational pull of American politics. And for now, that's the louder force. But you know, even when the media is trying to help out a political cause, that doesn't always mean it's successful. I have a pretty counterintuitive theory that the left-leaning media actually helped elect Donald Trump twice. They didn't mean to, but their efforts to defeat him backfired in multiple ways. Had they been the referees they claimed to be instead of cheerleaders, I don't believe that Donald Trump would have been president. So you might find that video interesting. Hey, I hope I did a fair job here. If not, let me know in the comments. Let me know where I messed up. I try to stay active there. And if you did, come back again. Thanks for watching.